Let's start with Mark's Gospel. And if I knew we were close to the end last week, I know we're closer this week. This is a big chapter. There's a lot going on. And it's a chapter that I want us to study, and I want us to ask questions of, and I want us to engage with. And it's also a chapter that I want us to just hear again and experience. So I might suggest that we take turns reading paragraphs and read through the whole chapter, and then we'll come back and talk. Does that sound okay to everybody? So I think, well, I hope everyone's Bibles have paragraph breaks in the same places as this one. But if you're willing to just somebody start, and then whoever is to the left of them, just pick up at the next paragraph when they stop. Does that sound good? And we'll just go around until we get it all. So I'll just let whoever feels called jump in.
I will. That puts Ron on the spot after me. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices.
Time's out. That's next week.
We're on 14.
We're on 15.
15. Oh, 15.
We're both lost.
Sorry.
We're close to the end, but we're not there yet.
I read 16 for this week.
Okay.
As soon as it was morning, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed.
Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began salutating him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him.
They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ah, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself, come down from the cross." In the same way the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. No, I'm sorry, 33.
Sorry. Where does it stop?
30, we'll start on 33.
Okay. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi.
Lama sabachthani.
Which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, look, he is calling for Elijah. Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, fixed it on a reed, offered him a drink, and said, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. But Jesus let out a cry and breathed his last. Then the curtain of the sanctuary was split in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who was standing opposite him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, this man really was God's son.
There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem.
When everybody had come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea came, a prominent member of the council, who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. And he gathered up courage and went in before Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus.
Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph brought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid.
Thank you. It's quite something to hear that whole story read through. You know, I once heard a friend talking about this chapter say that we're not meant to think about this necessarily in theological terms. We're meant to enter into the story emotionally. And of course, it's a story that we've broken up into 16 sessions here. But if you cast your minds back to September, and I hope some of you engaged in that activity of reading through the gospel all in one sitting, the emotion here is great. Here's Jesus, who's been this whirlwind of activity, casting out demons, cleansing lepers, moving from town to town, healing mothers-in-law, all, feeding thousands, getting in boats back and forth across the lake. This frenzy of activity which kind of came to a screeching halt in the middle of the gospel with the ascent up the mountain and the transfiguration. And now, for the last several weeks, we've just been slowly walking with Jesus from there all the way to Jerusalem in this moment. But once he's arrested, all that activity comes back. But it's not his actions. It's the activity of those around him that has now become this frenzy. And this man who was so powerful and who healed and cured so many dies this brutal death. The same friend said, anybody is qualified to teach this chapter in Mark's gospel if their life has been changed in some way by the crucifixion, and if they're willing to share So I wondered at the beginning, how many of you have been in a moment in your life when you felt like you've hit rock bottom? Really rock bottom. And if you have felt that way, did you find God there? Or more to the point, did God find and meet you there? Because the witness of this chapter is that God is present, even in that. Not that I would wish anybody has had a rock bottom experience, but we're all older than the age of 15, and I suspect we have. And I hope that in some of those moments, there was a light that you could see. Whether you called that light God, or Jesus, or the best friend in the entire world, who I would suggest God sent to you in that moment, right? The things that nearly break us, that crack open a space for God to enter. So let me stop talking and let me just ask. I'm going to try again what Pastor Nancy tried last week. When you read this chapter before you came tonight, when you heard it read here tonight, tell me about the feelings that it brought up for you. Not the thoughts, but the feelings.
I wasn't sure we were supposed to say it out loud.
Yeah, say it out loud.
Mourning.
Mourning, sadness.
Because like his parents, like technically Joseph didn't like father him, but like his parents just lost their son, and God lost his son, and all these people lost this wonderful guy. Even though they may or may not have known he was like Jesus, they still lost somebody. That's still hard.
So you experienced the sadness of those who loved him, who were there and watched it happen. Yeah. That's entering into Scripture. Having felt that at this story might change the way you interact with someone in your life who loses a child. Having understood God's sorrow at losing a child and Jesus' parents' sorrow. Right? Yeah. What other feelings?
Anger. Anger at the people who killed him.
Anger.
Yeah. That's the way I respond instead of sadness.
Yeah. Tell me more about that anger. Tell us more about that anger.
Oh, I don't know. I know when my son died about a year and a half ago, I was angry for several months because he had wasted his life. You know, I wasn't sad that he was dead. I was just angry at him because he had wasted so much potential. That doesn't seem to go with this story. Because Jesus was certainly fulfilling his potential when he was here on the earth. But I'm angry at the people who didn't understand him and who wanted him dead because they were afraid of him. They were afraid of what he might do to their jobs, you know. And yet it was God's will that Jesus die and rise again. So, it's all just playing out.
I might suggest they are related. Your son's death and your anger there and your anger here. And I might suggest you're entering into the story in a similar way as a parent who knows what it is to lose a child and who has felt a different feeling than sorrow over that.
Well, I get sad when I think about Mary,
Yeah.
because she was his mother, and she followed him around, apparently, according to the Gospels. She was one of his retinue, if I'm correct. And she was there when he died, and how she could do that, I don't know. But when we do the Stations of the Cross, and we come to the one where they take him down from the cross, and we see the Pietà enacted, that's when I get really sad.
Sure. Me too.
It's hard to lose a son. I've lost two.
Thank you for sharing that. As for whether it was God's will, that's a theological reflection, and I'm going to put a pin in that for a little bit. And we're going to stick with feelings for just a little. Other feelings?
I think I'm always struck by the brutality of empire and the bravery of women.
The brutality of empire and the bravery of women.
In the face of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Those are really powerful images, aren't they? The brutality of empire makes me feel fear in the pit of my stomach, because empire still exists. We don't call our president an emperor, but empire still exists.
They're ordinary people that were reinforcing it. I think I'm always shocked that Jesus didn't actually die in the beating part. Like every time we talk about that, I'm like, that just seemed so awful. And, empire seems like such a big word, but they're like our little individual vignettes of people that participated in the propagation of this cruelty, that were just normal people, that didn't gain anything by going so over the top with brutality.
Right. And I think it's really important when we read this text on Good Friday that we read it in parts, which we didn't do tonight, but you got a flavor of that, multiple readers. And the part where the crowd cries, "Crucify him," is played by the congregation, which every year puts me in touch with the fact that if I had been alive at that time, the strong likelihood is that I would have been following my leaders and standing in the courtyard and screaming, "Crucify him," and calling for that level of violence from empire. And the chance that I'm one of those brave women, there's just a handful of them. That's who I want to be. Becoming brave like these women, that's the work of a lifetime. That's the work of many hours of the way of love.
I think what you just said helped me identify what I was probably feeling but not allowing myself to feel. It's really weird because I didn't do a lot of reading of the Bible and stuff growing up in the Catholic Church and Catholic school. But every now and then we read something and there is a song that's stuck in my head or an experience and and I don't know if this is in the Episcopal Church too. Were you there when they crucified my Lord, that song?
Literally what I was thinking.
Okay, that fellow Catholic.
Like,
So that was coming and I'm thinking, why would I, and right before you said that, I'm like, oh, there's that's a guilt feeling. Like, where was I there and what role was I playing?
I think playing on that, like, if you actually think about that song and the somberness or like tone in which it's usually sung, I think that that's actually what typically resonates with me when I think about this, like in my reflection, because literally before she said it,
it was like to come up with the emotion that you were asking us to admit, I actually had to repeat the words in my head because that's what I was thinking. And so I think about like, or rather I feel like I think a somberness as it relates to like this, and I think all of the experiences of like attending Good Friday services and like having it be brought very like close in a literal way, or being somebody who does, you know, in a position where we're repeating, you know, crucify him, kind of feeling those things. I think on another level, unrelated to somber, I sort of have this like maybe slightly detached, like overthinking it of sort of what if they hadn't. I don't know why that has always like plagued me anytime we get to the crucifixion, but like where would we be if they hadn't? And I think that like philosophically, I like to like think about that sometimes. And I think with that, there's like a feeling of confusion as well, because I think as a kid, when you're learning all of the biblical stories of the gospel growing up, it's very easy to just quickly like buy into it, right? Like it's, at least a lot of it, I think it's easy to just take it hook, line, and sinker, because I mean, you don't have a lot of things as a child that are like pulling you in a resisting direction. And so I think as a kid growing up, I always was just like, man, that wasn't that hard. Like that took a really nasty turn real quick, and how that roughly impacted, I mean, obviously all of eternity and history, you know, in that moment. And yet it was supposed to happen. Like as an adult, I recognize like that is what was supposed to happen after the fall. But then it's kind of like, well, like could have it gone, like I don't know, it probably could not have gone the other direction, but I think I've always played with that feeling. And then I think on another level, like I think I've always been like, in this, I actually feel like weird saying this out loud, I think I've always been a little bit maybe detached, probably as like a defense mechanism from the vulnerability of it. But in speaking to like the detachment, I think I've always just had this defense of like, well, this is horrifying. And like the point Kat made of it's like the brutality is so harsh. Simultaneously, I'm always like, well, he is God. He's supposed to be like I hate to say he's like supposed to be doing this, but I think like there's been a level where I've gotten there, but I know that that's probably not the right frame of reference to be in, but I know it's like it's a defense mechanism that I go to of like, well, he's God, so it's a little different. But I think it's because that was always my feeling prior to really maybe deeply meditating on the actual humanness of him as Jesus. Like I think I wanted to have a detachment that this is God, but I think as an adult I have a much closer, I guess, understanding or deeper understanding now of like the humanness and how that is so integrated. Like he didn't get all these exceptions because he was God. He still fully felt everything on a human level.
Absolutely. That's the importance of fully human.
Well, and I honestly don't know that I really contemplated that like deeply until this class, the fully human part.
Excellent.
I feel a lot of disgust throughout a lot of it, like very viscerally. Like when I was reading this beforehand, particularly at Pontius Pilate, the way that he plays with Jesus, who's like his captive, is just hard, and it's really like just disgusting. And then the way that he like brings him out like he's like a cattle like being led to slaughter to be like auctioned off in front of this crowd is like disgusting. And then I just like, I feel like I don't like the framing that it was. I mean, I get that everybody involved was like a participant in what was transpiring, but also like I don't like the way necessarily that the narrative is like frames Pilate as kind of this just like bystander when he clearly isn't.
He's the guy who could stop it.
He's the guy that could stop it. And this like false choice between kill one person, kill another person is disgusting to me. And it just like, I don't know, the entire affair is just like, I don't know, it makes me really upset.
Scripture's full of those guys.
Yeah.
Think about King Herod. when he says, anything you want, I'll give it to you. Oh, I'd like the head of John the Baptist. And because he made a promise, he really couldn't do anything about it. He was King Herod. Think of Jephthah in the Old Testament who comes back from battle and says, God, if I win this battle, I'll sacrifice the first thing that I see to you. And his daughter comes out. And there's nothing I could do. I made a vow to God. Oh, really? God wouldn't have a conversation with you about that? You don't even want to try? Right? Scripture's full of these leaders who are weak.
Brutal guys back then, and well, they're not that there aren't now, but think about the slaughter of all those babies after Jesus was born.
Disgust.
I think with Pilate too, he's just a people pleaser. I mean, I'm wondering, he has no moral values. You know, he's trying to pawn it off on someone else, and you know, he has no backbone, I guess is what I'm saying.
Mm.
And for a leader, that's just disgusting.
It is disgusting. Yeah. I saw Ron waving over there.
Well, my feeling runs counter to what's been expressed in the room. It's actually a feeling of great hope, partly because of the courage of these women, the courage of Joseph of Arimathea, who goes to Pilate and puts his own self in jeopardy and says, I want this body. I want to give this guy a decent burial. The courage of Jesus to say, this is what is for me. This is why I have come. And to simply endure that. I mean, as you pointed out, empire, as far as we know civilization, going back, empire has always been with us. Empire is always brutal. Empire is invariably unjust. And yet there are people willing to say, you know, I'm the one who can stand and let you run a sword through me and pray for you at the same time. So it's, I don't know, it's counter, hope surprises me, but yeah, hope.
You know, asking for the body of a crucified person was not done. It was shameful and potentially dangerous. And yet he does it. Hope. In a world of bad actors, they're not all bad. Shimon.
Yeah, my feeling was reveal what a wonderful things Jesus did in the previous chapter, and then he ended up in the chapter 15 and got killed. So my first reaction was, you're doing the right thing, you're doing the good thing, and you follow the teaching of God. Not necessarily you always end up in a happy ending. So which also reminded me, I'm still reading the C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and he explained at the beginning for someone who's not a Christian yet. He said, when you encounter certain things, before you make a decision, there's always two choices. For example, someone drowned in the river. Should you rescue or not? If you rescue, of course, you would save that person. But however, if you try to rescue, you're risking your own life. So your instinct tells you, oh, I better back off. Yeah, my own life is more important. So there's a third voice there is, that's the right thing to do, even that risking your own life. I think my understanding was, if you look at those examples of Jesus' follower, like Peter denied him 3 times. And then some of them, they know you're doing the right thing, there will be danger. And yeah, so, but you still should do it. So that's what Jesus showed you the example. That was also explained. All the 12 apostles also died because of Jesus set example for them. And of course, there will be greater reward. That's something, yeah. So that was my reaction.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And also that's why people say the way Jesus said, I'm the way. The way to show you. Do the right thing, even that it means risk.
I like the example that C.S. Lewis offers. It's not all crucifixion when it happens in our lives, right? Thankfully. And yet, I mean, I'll speak from my own life. When my mother became a widow and her health deteriorated, at a certain point it became clear that she could not continue to live in Florida on her own. And I decided I would move her here. And I have a sister who said, don't do that. My relationship with her is not good. I'm having all these other personal problems in my life. This will ruin my life. This will ruin your life, she said. It was the right thing to do. I knew it would be hard. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done in my entire life. Within 3 weeks of her arrival, I was frantically calling around everywhere I could find to get a counselor, calling my doctor for an anti-anxiety medication. Right, I mean, it was hard. And it was the right thing to do. And God was there. And that was hard to see in it, and easier to see as I've emerged from it, and far easier to see now that she's passed on, right? And we all have stories of taking up a cross and following after Jesus because we know it's the right thing to do. It's not going to be any fun, and it's going to be really hard, and we might be all on our own doing it. And that's the life we're called to live. It's this way. The church has never codified or agreed upon what it is that happens in this chapter that saves us, this chapter and the next. How is it that Jesus' death on a cross saves humanity? There are lots of different ideas about it. Some feel that we had been held enslaved to Satan from the fall, and that we had to be ransomed. So you've heard about Jesus ransomed us or saved us. Some hold that there was a debt that had to be paid to Satan to get us back, and it was too big to be paid, and so God paid the debt with Jesus. One guy addended to that it was a trick, though, because once Satan had taken the bait and let us all go, Jesus said, "Ha-ha, can't hold me," and off he went, which doesn't, for me, really resonate, because I'm not sure that's how God plays in the world. For me, at least, the way I think of it, and I'm kind of coming back to this was God's will for him, which Jesus seems to think it was. I'm not sure when Jesus is indicating this is God's will for him, I'm not sure what Jesus is saying he believes God's will to be. Is it that it was God's will for him to be crucified and to die? Is it that it was God's will for him to continue on his mission in the face of those who had violent plans for him and not fight back violently, no matter what that happened to lead to? But for me, at least, it's not just this chapter and the next, which is so much of what the church teaches, that this is it. For me, it is that God, who created us and through sin became alienated from us, took on human flesh and came and lived among us as one of us, fully human, feeling all the feelings, physical and emotional, and never sinned, and didn't return violence with violence. okay, he overturned some tables in the temple, but he didn't harm any of God's people. And when they killed him, he didn't fight back. He submitted to the violence in the world and rose again. And it's something about carrying our human nature through all of that. Early childhood, adolescence. This really helps if you have teenagers in your house, right? Even adolescence, Jesus lived through. And adulthood and ministry and temptation and fear and pain and death at the hands of someone else without fighting back, and rose again. And that opens up a pathway for that to be possible in our lives. Maggie.
What do you think he was praying for when he asked God to let that cup pass from him?
I think he was probably scared to death. And I think he was hoping God would say, yes, you should get up and leave this place now before they kill you, honey.
And then, what do you think he meant? But not my will, but thine be done.
I think somehow he heard a response from God that says, you are where you're supposed to be, and you're doing what you're supposed to do by being in this place, teaching these people right now about who I am. And I need you to keep doing that. And I mean, I don't know. Did they talk about the cross? Did Jesus say at that point, I know they're going to put me on a cross and I don't want to do it, and God said, I need you to do it? I don't know. But I don't think they have to have had that particular conversation. I think it could have been more general. I think it could have been like me in the months before I got on the plane and brought my mother back here, praying every night, God, would you send somebody else to take care of her? And God never did.
But that's the passage in the Bible that we pin God's will on, that it was God's will that Jesus be crucified and rise again. We can't forget that last part.
Yeah, it's all of it. In my personal theory of atonement, it's probably closest to the one that's described as Christ as victor, is that it's the incarnation and the life and the death and the resurrection and the ascension into heaven. It's all of it together that opens up a pathway for salvation,
Right.
which is very much less focused on death
Right.
than a lot of the teaching that's out there among Christians about what saves us, right? We talked about the image of God early on, and that God, the ancients thought about that as like a physical organ within us, the imago Dei, that got damaged and wouldn't work properly after sin came into our lives. And
Can you say that again?
yes, the ancients thought about things in very concrete ways. So the image of God that they thought of it as something God put into us. So you've got a heart, and you've got a liver, and you've got a kidney, and you've got an image of God. And once sin comes into the world, the image of God that is within you can't function properly anymore. It's like it's been marred, like a record that has a slashed little part of it or something, right? And Christ comes and has an imago Dei in him because he's fully human. And that's never damaged. And somehow, through his life and death and resurrection and ascension, with his imago Dei intact, it's like this beam goes out to everyone else's imago Dei and repairs it. And opens up a channel for that to be repaired. It's just one way of thinking of it. Of course, they never dissected anybody, and if they did, they didn't find the imago Dei in there, right? But they tended to think of things in very physical, substantial types of ways, right? So that it's the same thinking that goes behind, well, he's got two substances in one being, right? He's got the human substance and the divine substance in one being.
Sounds like an update.
Sounds like what?
Sounds like a server update.
Well, yeah, I don't know, but it's an interesting way to think of it, yeah. He's Apple, he just
Yeah.
pushes out the update, and
They
we all go to
updated.
sleep at night, and then boom, works better for a while.
I feel like that resonates a lot more than like, it's never like set well with me, like the whole like devil ransom thing. I think mainly because like, I think that that's rendering way too much power to like something that is not God for me. And like, I'm not saying that I like don't believe in the existence of like evil or the devil or temptation. Like naturally, like I do believe in that. Probably, dare I say, like too much. But I think that sometimes that's the problem. Is I think that we actually like believe in like the evil attributes so much that we forget like the power of God. And I think that that's why like when I cited like, gosh, this can feel confusing for me sometimes, is because like, although I think it is really important for me to meditate on the human part of Jesus, I think I've always really meditated on the fact that he's God. And I think that that's really important, like, at least for me in understanding this. And I think the last analogy you gave where it's like almost like a body part that was injured and that then he himself is like, I guess, born with or possesses and is able to radiate out. That's easier for me to like, I guess, accept than that we were like ransomed to the devil in the Garden of Eden, you know, like, and I don't know, I had always been raised with that ransom concept.
Yeah.
So for whatever reason that works for me.
Yeah. The ransom theory of atonement has been prevalent for a very long time, and in a lot of churches, it's the only thing anybody talks about. But there are lots of theories of atonement, and I bet if you went out to our website or our YouTube channel, you would find at least 2 series of classes that Father Casey has taught on theories of atonement. One which he began before COVID began and finished online virtually, and another that he taught much more recently, maybe last year in Lent. And if you can't find that and you want me to look, email me or something and I'll see if I can find them. But Father Casey's taught that at least twice since I've been here. And the church, and by that I mean the whole group of people who call themselves Christians, but going back into the Roman Catholic tradition, has never said it's this theory of atonement that's the right one. It's always been a multiplicity of theories about how it might work, because we don't know. We don't know.
Live into the mystery.
Yeah.
Kind of like God says so. Because he says so.
Yeah. I mean, there's some things that just end with, well, I've read the Bible, I believe it to be the inspired word of God, and that's the conclusion that the scripture writers came to. It's the conclusion that many in our tradition came to, some through the ransom theory and others through the penal substitutionary atonement theory, and I mean, you know, they're all out there. Other thoughts, questions about this particular chapter? I'm trying to see if there's anything else in my notes I wanted to. Anybody else notice the litany of abandonment that happens in these last chapters? Judas, and then the other disciples, and then the Romans, and the people of the crowds, chief priests, so clergy abandon him. The bandits abandon him. And Jesus finally says, "Why have you abandoned me?" to God, because he feels abandoned by God. That's the worst of all, that he's fallen so low that he feels like God has abandoned him. Notice that he is expressing a feeling in that moment. He is not making a theological statement that God is not there. But he feels that God is not there. And even the women, they're there, but they're watching it from a distance. They're not right there.
I read the CEB version whenever I've been reading CEB a lot. I love it.
Common English Bible.
I got it I saw it because you have one, and I saw you using it several months ago. They don't call one of the people on the three crosses a bandit. They call him a rebel that was participant in an uprising, which I've been vaguely introduced to that concept before, but not. But I was always taught that the two other men on the crosses in the crucifixion were thieves or whatever. But I was like, so it's surprising to me that is a biblical translation translates it that way. Are you familiar at all with that?
I can tell you that crucifixion was a method of punishment that was intended to show off the power of Rome and the control of Rome. It's all about empire.
Also, the word that the authors use for those people, so there is a Greek word for thief. It's a cognative for klepto, kleptoi, whatever the Greek word actually is. I don't remember the ending. And they don't use that.
They don't use that
It's
word.
It's another word that's more like outlaw. A lot of writings about this like to, in an effort to translate it into modern words, would say terrorist, basically, being caught up in the uprising. You're a terrorist to some people and you're like a hero, a freedom fighter to the other side.
And they believed themselves most likely to be freedom fighters,
yes,
right? Because there was an uprising around.
They were being crucified for basically terrorism and insurrection.
What Barabbas had been accused of.
Was it a Jewish uprising, or was it
There were always Jewish uprisings against Rome. They were obviously never very effective.
Yeah.
The last one led to the destruction of the temple. Right, and then the quashing of that religious practice. Look back, if you would. We did this last week, but we're going to do it again because we've been talking about these Markin sandwiches. And before we move on, remember how Mark began, chapter 1, verse 1. The beginning of the good news, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And who acknowledges that here at the end? Verse 39 of chapter 15. When the centurion, the Roman centurion, stood facing him.
Truly you are the Son of God.
Truly this man was God's son. This is the biggest sandwich there is. It's the whole gospel is wrapped up in, I'm going to tell you that this was God's son. And by the end of the gospel, Mark is telling you that even the Romans, or at least one Roman, understood that. I think that's kind of breathtaking. I think that's kind of breathtaking. All right. Well, should we take a break? There are a few Girl Scout cookies over there. If you choose to have a Girl Scout cookie and eat it indoors, please distance yourself from others. You can always take your cookie outside if you need to do that. We'll come back in 5 minutes and carry forward.
All right, why don't y'all go ahead and we're just going to point to where this all is coming from. Turn in your prayer book. Do y'all have prayer books?
Yes.
Prayer books to just a prayer book. I might have someone do a reading in a little bit from the Bible, but you won't all need one. 305. Y'all should be super familiar with this part of the prayer book by now. So I'm going to ask the question, and y'all will give the answer. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself?
I will.
Excellent, because if you said anything other than that, then we'd have to start over. So part of this baptismal covenant, this core statement of faith, the church has done lots of things to sort of encapsulate the faith of the church. Catechisms and books of discipline and all sorts of other things. And we've got a little bit of that, but really for Episcopalians, the baptismal covenant is really kind of the core of what we believe. It contains a creed. The baptismal covenant is the Apostles' Creed. And then it's got these statements that sort of flesh out what it means to live a life of faith, the life that the church calls us to live, the life that God calls us to live. And so it's not where we put just any old thing. It's where we put really important things. And y'all have talked about this. And so if something is in the baptismal covenant, it's it's real. So seeking and serving Christ in all persons and loving your neighbor as yourself is core to your life as a Christian, core to your identity as a baptized member of the body of Christ. So the first part of that is to seek. So what that means is seek is a very active thing. Seek is not a passive activity. Seeking and serving Christ in all persons does not mean waiting for the people to come to you necessarily. Seeking and serving means really going out beyond your comfort zone and finding people that need help in any sort of way. When we talk about serving Christ in all those people, it's about seeing Christ in them. One of my favorite little moments that will stick with me forever. A lot of y'all will remember Deacon Liz O'Donnell. Deacon Liz was a member of the staff at the church for a long time, and she was very active with things like Eucharistic visitors, but she also did all sorts of outreach things. But ministering to the sick and the lonely was kind of her diaconal calling. We've talked a little bit about deacons and what it means to be a deacon. And years ago, I went with the Austin Street ministry to go do the big dinner on the eve of Thanksgiving. That's one of the coolest things that we do at this parish is the day before Thanksgiving, we pack up, crates full of turkey and tubs of dressing and green beans, and we go and we feed hundreds of homeless people. And I was on green beans, and that's a good duty if you can get it. And we were there. We served all the food, and Deacon Liz, with tears in her eyes, just said, "I saw the face of Christ in every single one of those men," and it was just that. To me, that encapsulated this imperative. It was really doing the work of going out and finding the people and serving their needs. When we talk about, I'm going to save that to see if we've got time. I found an article that I think can help us dive into and explore sort of what it means to do that as a group, as a parish. So if you'll take one and pass it, and then we're going to read it together, and we're just going to talk about what's in it, sort of our insights. So we'll get those around, and then I will take a volunteer if they would like to read it. And if you've got a pen or something, just highlight, underline, or make notes as we go through this, just about what your thoughts are, what strikes you about this piece. I'm also bragging on my diocese here. When we talked about polity, I belong to the Episcopal Church in North Texas, which used to be called the Diocese of Fort Worth. And so that's who's mentioned here as well. So this is about a church in Arlington. So it's local. It's just from a couple years ago. It's a pre-pandemic. Look at them being all happy and close together without their masks on. So would someone like to read this article for us? Read it out loud? Yeah, it's not very long.
Somebody who hasn't
Anyone?
read yet. I'll read it.
Okay. Thanks, Barbara.
Okay. The budding food pantry at St. Albans Episcopal Church grew out of the cherished desire to find ways to connect with the University of Texas at Arlington, or UTA, 2 blocks away. I don't think we really knew what that was going to be, said Doug Hunt, a St. Albans vestry member. Pam Hardaway, another vestry member, said the parish's previous ministry of offering lunch to UTA students was popular for a while, as were some night activities, but then they seemed to wane. Last May, the Reverend Kevin Johnson, St. Albans rector, and some parishioners talked with a representative of the university's student affairs office, and the conversation quickly moved into food, he said. The university has a large number of international students, mostly Hindu and Muslim. They have other food assistance options, but they weren't as robust as they had been, according to Hunt. And they were being proselytized, said Johnson, referring to feeding ministries of other Christian organizations. So something clicked, and we said, maybe that's our niche, said Hunt. They began to research how best to set up such a ministry. The pantry became part of the Four Saints Food Pantry, a ministry of a group of Episcopal parishes in the Diocese of Fort Worth. It formed another partnership with Green's Produce, a local farm market and garden center. After scouting locations and contacting UTA's International Student Organization, the group chose a location just off campus near an international student housing area. It is actually the parking lot of another church. The student organization suggested a once-a-month distribution on a Saturday afternoon. The pantry launched in November. The group had 50 bags of food and 32 students came. December saw a drop of 18 students. A decline, Hunt said, could be attributed to the double whammy of final weeks and a home football game. The pantry did not run in January because of semester break. The effort has been evolving ever since. Johnson said recently that UTA's Student Affairs Office asked that St. Albans move the pantry to on campus to the athletic center, which gets a lot of foot traffic on Saturdays. The International Student Organization stepped up its publicity, and the Student Counseling and Psychological Services Office asked the church to provide food stocks for students whom they knew were experiencing food insecurity. In 2 hours, on February 2nd, they gave away everything they had with them, 65 bags of food, plus fresh fruit and vegetables from Green's Produce, 50 loaves of bread, and dozens of jars of spices and cans of coconut milk, among other things, said Johnson. One young woman asked, "You mean you're not going to make me pray with you first?" Johnson told her, "It's just free food, no strings attached." Then he said, a big smile appeared on her face. The program is on measurably positive trajectory, Johnson said, and the parish is excited. It really was one of those things where their needs lined up with our resources. Hardaway agreed, adding, "I think this is a calling that maybe we have not really been listening to for a while."
Thanks, Barbara. So, talking about seeking and serving Christ in all persons, about going out into the world and finding those who are hungry or homeless or things like that, and serving their needs. What about this article strikes y'all as a particularly, as a sign of sort of a successful ministry in that respect? Yeah?
In the beginning, they said that they had some other food assistance options, but they weren't as robust as they had been. And then it like evolved, and it ended up being in a place with more foot traffic and people, and instead of just kind of like in the parking lot where it's just kind of tucked away, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that probably helped them a lot.
That's right. In our work of serving people, not everything that we do is going to work right off the bat. This is a great example of a ministry that wasn't afraid to quit after just a few setbacks. That they said, "Oh well, that's not working. How can we keep trying to improve this ministry. Exactly. What else about this struck you?
The fact that they weren't trying to proselytize
Mm-hmm.
the kids from other religions,
Mm-hmm.
I think is extremely important.
Well, yeah. What are some of your other thoughts about that part?
I agree with that part. That stood out to me a ton. I think the fact that they also were not, sort of in a sense, trying to hold them hostage on the theme of ransom today, regarding you have to pray to eat.
Mm-hmm.
I think that says, I think a lot about sort of the downside of how a lot of religion today is very transactional.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of evangelism is played up that way as well, that it's like a transactional action. So I think that was probably the most profound aspect, that it was a truly no strings attached, like, loving of your neighbor. And I think not that they at all hated these people or viewed them as enemies, but I think it goes back to the core teaching that, like, we are commanded to love even our enemies. And of course, again, these people are not enemies, they're just hungry, but I think the fact that ideologically there's such a perception that there's this great difference, and that, Muslims and Christians wouldn't, possibly be caught at the same table, and here they are. And I just think it's a beautiful thing. I think also in the passage, just in general, the fact that this is a partnership with their international student organization speaks to, I think, just serving greater diversity. And I know in one of these classes we talked about how, like, at a lot of churches in Dallas have a lot of money, a lot of education, a lot of white people, amongst other things. And I think it's beautiful that, like, there's the concept of truly seeking Christ in all persons, and that's really what they've done here, regardless of, like, race, religion, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And the seeking aspect of it, like, they knew that there were people in need, and for whatever reason, the food wasn't making the connection with those people who were in need, and so they took these extra measures to make sure those people got what they needed.
Yeah, they really went out and started asking questions. Didn't wait for the problem to, like, fall into their lap or come in through the church doors.
Well, and on the note of seeking, the fact that in the beginning they talked about how they just had wanted to develop some sort of ministry or relationship with UT Arlington, they didn't know what it was going to be. And I think that speaks for seeking too, knowing that, it's like seeking, like you should be, like, searching for some way to give back, but simultaneously, like, it doesn't have to be this great thing. It can be your neighbor in your backyard. It can be the person next to you, and I'm assuming that they were probably in very close proximity.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Oh, yeah, the article mentioned the international student at UT Arlington. I just want to mention they don't have to be homeless. They don't have to. Yeah.
Yes.
For
Right.
some of the students, I just want to say this coming Friday, Sarah and I going to Garland to be with a group of international students, but the party was hosted by Episcopalian, associated with the Episcopalian Church Epiphany.
Oh, yes.
They're in the Richardson. So
Mhm.
they have a certain number of the UTD students who are already, yeah. So what I told Mother Rebecca the other day, I accidentally walked into their church. They gave me a tour. They told me,
You met
I
Deputy
haven't
Randall.
met those
Oh, okay.
people yet. I haven't met those people yet. They invited us for a Chinese Lunar New Year, because the February 1st was the Chinese Lunar New Year of the Year of the Tiger. So then the Reverend Bessie Randall immediately put out her phone and called this person. This person invited us to go there. I haven't met them yet, but she told me there will be like 20 or 30, half of the international student, half of Episcopalian Church member there. I haven't met them yet, but if anyone interested, I will report that to you.
Great.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that Epiphany's
Yeah.
doing something.
So yeah, my point was reach out, seek to help those people, not necessarily in the way, not necessarily in the way of charity. Yeah, some of the students they might be in need of help in any way, or they might just want to know more about our church.
A few other things I want to make sure we get to about this that I think are key, and they're just kind of hidden in there. The leaders of this particular ministry. So Father Kevin is the rector of the church, and he helps out. But the people that are really doing a lot of the talking are the lay leadership. So this speaks to the idea that this is ministry that belongs to all of us. And I know a little bit more about the Four Saints Food Pantry, but it's really largely a lay-led initiative. And so I think that speaks to something that comes up. Father Kevin, definitely a spokesperson for the church, and it's important for him to be a part of things because there's like visibility that comes with that. But really, like a lot of the work's being done by the laity, and that's incredibly important. There's the shout out to the Four Saints Food Pantry and the diocese. This is another good reminder that we're not Congregationalists. We don't just like live in a little Transfiguration island, but we're really part of this larger organization, this diocese. We partner with all kinds of people, and this is a good example of how that can work really well. I like when they're mentioning the kinds of foods that they're giving out. They mention like spices and cans of coconut milk. That they're trying to if you're trying to feed people that are Hindu or Muslim or just other cultures, trying to provide something that's not just peanut butter and boxed macaroni and cheese, that kind of thing. But yeah. So I imagine a lot of vegetarian things that would be in that sort of that food kit. Not getting discouraged when the number of people to come that pick up bags of food kind of goes down, but really sort of pivoting and finding other ways to make the ministry more successful. And sometimes that means moving to the spot where the traffic is, and sometimes that means like skipping a month because nobody's going to be there. And there's a couple of other great things. Throughout it, there's this constant theme of discernment about the congregation looking for something to do, the congregation going out and talking to other people in the community and finding out where the need is and coming back and figuring out if this is really what they're called to do. Because the churches have the resources and they could do any number of things, but doing the work of discernment together to figure out what kind of work they're supposed to be doing is incredibly important. And there's this other one towards the end about needs lining up with resources. That we all have a certain finite number of resources. Lots of churches have, as you said, lots of money. And so, but nothing is infinite. Finding a ministry that lines up with your resources, and that includes, and that's not just big organizations, but individuals in our own journeys to seek and serve Christ in all persons. You're finite individuals. You have a limited amount of time, and so much that you can give. And understanding what your resources are, when you're going out and serving other people in the world, will make you a more effective servant to those people. Gosh, that was really fast, but we're trying to get in 2 presentations in one night.
Are these churches in the Diocese of Fort Worth and the Diocese of North Texas?
These are Episcopalians, not ACNA people. They belong to the Episcopal Church in North Texas.
Which used to be called the artist formerly known as, right? You understand that?
Yes. So these are Episcopalians. Father Kevin was on a bishop slate recently. Yeah, they're good folks.
So it's now the Diocese of North Texas?
Its official name is the Episcopal Church in North Texas. It is a diocese. It just doesn't have the word diocese in its name. And we're living into that identity too. And sometimes that's difficult. Seeking and serving Christ in all persons. It is a constant. It's a will to go out and work for people. It's a will to go out and try to make the lives of people who are sick, poor, oppressed, better. It's a statement that God wants their lives to be improved as well, and that we are to act as God's hands and feet in the world to accomplish God's purposes for creation as we move closer and closer to the coming kingdom. That's a wrap up. And now, Ron is going to come talk for a little bit.
Ron Damholt.
Those of you who don't know me, I'm Ron Damholt. Those of you who do know me have probably heard this before, so if you need to take a break and go get
If you want to maybe just attach that to your
Oh, thank you. I do try to vary it a little bit from year to year so that we don't have too many sleeping folk in the audience. Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? Yes, indeed. So I'm going to start by reading a little passage in the 8th chapter of Romans that I take to be, at least it's plausible, the core, the very core of what Paul's getting at. It's short, but and I will come back to it I'll come back to it in 18 minutes or maybe 16 minutes. We'll see. For I reckon that the sufferings we now endure bear no comparison with the glory as yet unrevealed, which is in store for us. The created universe is waiting with eager expectation for God's children to be revealed. It was made subject to frustration, not of its own choice, but by the will of him who subjected it, yet with the hope that the universe itself is to be freed from the shackles of mortality and is to enter upon the glorious liberty of the children of God. That the universe itself, the entire universe, is to be freed from the shackles of mortality and is to enter upon the glorious liberty of the children of God. So this presentation will be in two parts. One is 16 minutes, I hope. One is 2 minutes. The 2 minutes will be peace post. The 16 minutes is actually going to be a little theology of the New Testament. It is said about philosophers that they cannot hope to be right. I'm going to take this thing off. I guess I have the right to do that. That philosophers cannot hope to be right. The best they can hope for is to be interesting. And so I will shoot for the lesser goal of trying to be interesting. A few paragraphs from an article of 2015 in the Anglican Theological Review. It is no surprise, then, that most English-speaking people think that the New Testament does not say much about justice, because the Bibles they read do not say much about justice. This is a remarkable statement, not because it's false, it is not, but because the questions it raises are so astonishing. Jesus, rooted in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, spending his life teaching and caring largely for those disenfranchised by Roman oligarchy and Jewish Second Temple hierarchy, failed to talk with them about the justice of God? And Paul, serving Christians who lived in an empire, we talked about empire earlier, which often believed itself the very fount of justice, but in practice was generally the source of partiality toward the wealthy and powerful, and of injustice toward the poor and enslaved. This Paul did not think to write to them of God's loving justice, both incarnated in and promised through Jesus. In fact, God's justice was a central theme for both Jesus and Paul, a theme absolutely inescapable in the texts of both the Gospels and of Paul's letters. That is to say, it's at once inescapable and greatly obscured, largely because of a translation issue long recognized in scholarly literature. The rendering in most English language New Testaments of the Greek word dikaiosune, this is where it gets a little thick, as righteousness, rather than what would be the more appropriate translation, justice. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about this word. Transliterated, of course. The Greek word dikaiosune. Now, in
classical texts, think Plato, think Josephus, think almost any ancient philosophical text, this word appears often. And every time it appears in those texts, as far as I know, it is rendered justice. When it appears in Paul, when it appears in the Gospels, it is rendered righteousness. Only in the New Testament, and only actually in the Protestant tradition of the New Testament. Those of you who are from the Roman Catholic tradition, you've done much better than that. The Douay translation never renders this word righteousness. Almost always renders it justice. What in the heck does it really matter? And what difference does it make? And how did we get it wrong? If we got it wrong. Well, for me, the difference between righteousness and justice is one of nuance, but it's an important nuance. Righteousness can be taken to be interior holiness. One strives to be a righteous person. One strives to be obedient to God. One strives to be pious, a kind of interior purity. Justice has to do with my relationship to you and your relationship to her and our relationship to each other. Justice is an exterior function. That is to say, it's public. It has to do with public interpersonal behavior, right? What Paul is writing about in Romans is the whole thing is a thesis on justice. It's a philosophical treatise. It's a theological philosophical treatise on justice, not on righteousness. Now, that's quite a claim, of course. And the way that what went wrong, this is where I try to be interesting. What went wrong is that in the 14th century, the first complete English language translation of the New Testament was done by, not actually by Wycliffe himself. Wycliffe was an Oxford theologian who believed very strongly that the scriptures should be available to the people in the vernacular. He did not translate the New Testament that is named after him, but the scholars around him did at Oxford. It's called the Wycliffite version. Now it happens, this is not to be confused, incidentally, with a certain street in Dallas, just in case that one has two F's, so we'll take that off. It's Wycliffe. It happens that Wycliffe and the scholars around him had a fondness for Anglo-Saxon words, Anglo-Saxon being the ancient English speech. And they liked those words much more than the Norman French words, which frankly only came in at the Norman invasion in the 11th century, right? So they'd only been around a couple hundred years. Anglo-Saxon words went way back. The Anglo-Saxon translation of the Greek dikaiosune was right-wiseness. And if you think about the word upright in behavior, one speaks of her as an upright person or him as an upright person. Right-wiseness has the image of being a person who's just in their behavior, who is a good person, an honest person. So the Wycliffe group, when they came across dikaiosune in the New Testament, rendered it right-wiseness. If you read Chaucer, he uses this word a lot, and you'll find that in that context, he means justice. If you read Julian of Norwich, she uses it a lot. She means justice. So it's a good medieval Anglo-Saxon word. The Latin word that had come in with the Normans, I'm not going to get this right because I don't speak Latin, guys. Justitia, I think that is right, though. So this is the Latin word, of course, which looks an awful lot like justice. And the reason the Roman Catholics got it right is because during the reign of Elizabeth, the Roman Catholics in England were persecuted. The Roman Catholic academics in England were persecuted. They took off and went to France, went to a place called Douay, and created the Douay translation of the New Testament. And of course, they were using the Latin Vulgate. They liked Latin. So they got it right. They talked about justice. Read a Roman Catholic translation of the New Testament, and you'll find justice all over the place in the Gospels and in Paul. Unfortunately, in our Protestant translations, it is obscured for this reason. Now, let me just read 3 short passages and see if I can demonstrate the force of this and the importance of this. So this is Paul in Romans. Let's see if I can get it right. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? Now, this is the New Revised Standard Version, which is still it's sort of the standard, right? It's even the scholarly standard today, largely.
Where are you?
It's 616. Thank you. But listen to it if we talk about justice. Do you not know that if you present yourselves as to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to justice? Right? And Paul is talking about our obedience to God leading to justice in our lives, not leading to a kind of interior holiness. In Ephesians, the 6th chapter, 13th through the 15th verses, if you want to follow it. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, so that you may be able to withstand on that evil day, having done everything to stand firm. Stand, therefore, and fasten the belt of truth around your waist, and put on the breastplate of righteousness. That almost sounds like the breastplate of self-righteousness. It's like, right? And that is a problem with this word, is it has become so entangled with the notion of self-righteousness. But if God is calling us to put on the breastplate of justice and to go on in the world and enact justice, well, that's a very different thing. It's a very different feeling. It seems to me, a very different nuance. 1 John 1:9. So it's not just Paul, it's not just the Gospels. If we confess our sins, he who is faithful and just, and that word is it's the root, decay, D-I-K-E. If he who is faithful and just will forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Now here's the astonishing thing, is that in that verse, right, God is called just, the just one. Dikaiosune, decay is the root. But in the latter part of the verse, the word is adikia, and it's translated not injustice, but unrighteousness, right? But in fact, what God is cleansing us from is all injustice. As we walk together, as we walk in the world, as we live in community, as we love each other, God is cleansing us from injustice in our lives. So it's, when you read the New Testament and encounter the word righteousness, if you think of justice rather than righteousness, I think it will be to your benefit. And I think the New Testament just becomes clearer as a document. And it just makes more sense. I mean, of course Paul was talking about justice. Of course Jesus lived out a life of loving justice. That's what it was about. So.
Your Common English Bible splits the difference.
Yeah, it does.
The first one, it says righteousness. The second one, it says justice. So it's not a complete fix. So we talked about what Bible should I read? Yes, lots of them.
More than one.
More than one.
Yeah, my favorite is the Revised English Bible, and it too splits the difference, actually. Sometimes it says justice, sometimes it says uprightness, and sometimes it says righteousness. And we could talk more about the Hebrew influence as well, which is not unimportant, but we're dealing with Greek here.
About the song, "The Kingdom of God is justice and peace and joy," but that comes out of the Roman Catholic tradition, doesn't it? It comes out too, right? Anyway.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Doesn't say righteousness and peace.
You heard
Right.
that, Maggie? You can't hear anything, but you heard me say I'm Roman Catholic.
Crack me up, Maggie. Sorry, that's all.
Ah, it's okay. So I'm just going to read, to sum up this part A here, and then we'll talk about Peace Post for a couple minutes. I'm going to read this section of Romans 8 once more, with which I started out. The created universe is waiting with eager expectation for God's children to be revealed. It was made subject to frustration, not of its own choice, but by the will of him who subjected it, yet with the hope that the universe itself is to be freed from the shackles of mortality and is to enter upon the glorious liberty of the children of God. We are called to be God's co-workers, Paul uses elsewhere, right? We are called to be God's co-workers in bringing restorative justice into the world, to work with God in setting all of creation free from its bondage to decay, so that all of creation, including the sphere of public justice, will finally obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God, right? Now, part B. In this little incarnation of the body of Christ that we call the Church of the Episcopal Church of the Transfiguration, there are lots of things and lots of ways that people engage in restorative justice, in bringing God's loving justice into the world. One in which I happen to be engaged is called Peace Post. What do we do in Peace Post? Once a month we meet, try to make it on the first Sunday of the month. Right now we're doing it on Zoom because the largest space we have to meet in isn't really big enough to be safe. So we're doing it on Zoom. But hopefully that will not be the case indefinitely. It's much more satisfying to do it in person. We meet to write letters to politicians, elected and appointed officials. We write to them about issues of justice on which we've reflected from the standpoint of being faithful people. And we usually try to tie those things to specific legislation that is pending before Congress, or specific actions that are being taken. Just examples of things we've written about in this year: violence against Native American women. There's a very important bill that was up around that. We've certainly written about climate change and climate issues, written about Palestinian human rights. We've written about drought and starvation in Afghanistan. Basically, we got out of Afghanistan and said, oh, well, we're done with that. My God, they're at the end of a 30-year drought. The economy is in the tank. It's estimated that 95% of the population it will shortly suffer food insecurity. It's just horrific. And the United States has pledged now $380 million to help Afghanistan, right? That is to say, that's just... So we write about those kinds of issues. We obviously need to remember these people. We've written about evictions in Dallas. In the first week of January, Dallas had more evictions than any city in the nation other than Houston, right? And basically the money to support landlords and renters has run out, or is about to run out. We've written about getting COVID vaccines out to the rest of the world. Something like 12% of the world population is at this point vaccinated. So those are the kind of things we write about, and we meet on Sunday starting at Adult Ed and run through the 11:15 service and unto about 2 o'clock, around 10 to 2. And if any of you want to join us, give me your email address and I'll put you on the list and send you a Zoom invitation and tell you when we're meeting again in person. But again, it's just one of many things, right? One of many. But as the incarnation of the body of Christ, this is what we're called to do. We're called to enact restorative justice. So, yeah, there it is. Thank you. Thank you.
another of our ministries